So our nervous system today is quite similar to the nervous system we had a couple of 100,000 years ago. But the environment in which we live is vastly different. And so today we have this kind of evolutionary mismatch, right? My biology and the environment in which I live in are very, very mismatched, right? Because I can log onto my phone and I can be connected to 7 billion other people and 7 billion people's problems and what's going on the other side of the world. And I continue to trigger the same stress response as if it was my neighbor or as the person in my tribe, right? So this idea of how quickly and how vastly our world has changed, but our nervous system hasn't really caught up to that. And so why breathing becomes this really powerful tool is I can actually start to grab the steering wheel now. Once I learn how to almost speak the language of my breath, even if things are stressful outside of me, I can take my breath and I can suggest to my nervous system things are okay. I am not in any immediate threat or danger. I just read a blog that was, yeah, perhaps a little bit scary or it was fearful, but let me reinstate to my nervous system that right now, in this present moment where I am, I'm safe, right? I don't need to run the stress response, the survival response, the threat response. I can actually keep engaging that recovery response or relaxation response. And so we have the tool within us to kind of create a little bit of a buffer zone between what's happening out there and how I'm responding. And when we do that, right, we get to start to change the channel of the nervous system. And we can, over time, consistently switch that channel from survival to healing, right? From surviving to thriving. And the more that I do that, the more my nervous system starts to become accustomed to that. And so, a point that I'm going to make a couple of times today, this isn't about you having to be aware of your breathing all of the time and controlling your breathing all of the time and always changing the channel, right? Our nervous system adapts and it learns. This is about kind of training your autopilot. With intentional practices done enough times, my nervous system starts to take that information and then begin to run its own autopilot. And so sometimes when I begin to talk to people about breathing, they're like, oh, this sounds like I'm going to just have to give up my job and leave my hand. And all I focus is on breathing in a way that supports my nervous system. Not the case, right? It is something that a tool that we learn to use in moments that we need it. And we trust that the nervous system has this capacity to adapt and evolve. And it does, right? We've all perhaps heard of the term neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is often talked about in terms of the brain, but the entire body is plastic, and plastic just meaning it can change its form, right? We adapt to what we do consistently. And so for many people, that childhood trauma or that back pain that I've struggled with for 10 years, or the state that I've been in terms of my stress or anxiety, we've adapted to that. And now, right now, is the opportunity that you have to start to change the information that your nervous system is responding to. And that's a really empowering thing. It is not, I'm not going to say it's easy. We just click our fingers and it's done. It does require some work. It requires some attention, some consistency. But one of the most powerful lessons I really try to give to all of the clients that I work with is your nervous system never loses the ability it has to adapt. And that should be a little kind of light at the end of the tunnel for many of you that have perhaps been on this difficult journey, right? I know healing journeys are often never linear and they're often far from smooth, but remembering that my nervous system never loses its ability to adapt. I just need to keep feeding it new information and it will continue to adapt to that. So over time, we start to kind of change the baseline of our nervous system, right? I can go from the I've always been an anxious person to I'm becoming a calm person, right? Not because I'm trying all the time, but because my nervous system is adapting to new information. One of the first points I want to kind of start with today is the power of awareness and the skill of learning a language. Right? You've kind of signed on here thinking we're talking about breathing, and here I am talking about learning languages. But one of the tools I'm going to suggest to you today is really just paying attention, and it is noticing my breath. And we're going to talk about formal and informal or online and offline tools a little bit today. But the first kind of point of actually becoming aware of your breath, I want you to think it is no different to you learning a language. And let me explain. If you were learning Spanish and you didn't speak any Spanish, and two people were in front of you having a conversation in Spanish, you would sit there and you would just be hearing noises. You have no idea what they're talking about because you don't speak that language, right? But as you start to learn Spanish, and you're sitting there and listening, you'll start to pick up a word here and there, right? He just said dog, and she said cat, and all right. The more that you learn, you start to get the context, perhaps, of a conversation. I think they're talking about animals, right? Eventually, you become proficient in this language. You can communicate, right? You can engage in that conversation. For most people, you do not speak the language of your breath just yet, right? So when you sit and try and do these practices of, for example, breath awareness, and you're looking for all this information that's coming from your breath, you're not going to get anything. You'll be like, I'm just sitting here, I'm breathing. What else am I meant to be noticing? Like, I'm not noticing anything. That's okay. You don't yet speak the language. You are learning, right? And remembering that you're not doing it wrong. It's not that you don't get it yet. It's just like, I'm just actually starting to learn this language. So in the early stages, I'm probably not going to understand a great deal. I need to keep learning. But as you begin to learn more and more of this language of your breath, right, in the same way that we explained going through and listening to a conversation, eventually you can communicate. And that's where we want to get to. And that is not going to happen to tomorrow. It's probably not going to happen next week, but if you actually take from this conversation we're having today and say, you know what, I'm going to put in the time and the effort and I'm going to learn to speak the language of my breath. Over time, you will begin to communicate very clearly with your nervous system, with your body, with your brain. And in doing so, be- you become the person that can start to influence the state that you're in. Whether we're talking about your mind, your emotions, your energy, right? You get to influence the state that your nervous system is generating. And so this learning of a language does take time. And the second most common question I get asked is, how long is it going to take? That's an impossible question to answer. Some of you will take away and you'll do this really consistently every day and you'll really work at it and you'll see these changes very rapidly in the space of days, if not weeks. Some of you will come back to this every now and then. Oh, that breathing thing I learned about, let me do a practice here and there. And it's going to take a lot longer to learn this language. I really think, as I mentioned, I've kind of been immersed in this world for probably 8 years now. And more, I've come to the conclusion that breath work is nothing more than a line of communication. That's all it is. Now, the key point here is whether you're aware of it or not, you are communicating with your nervous system. Right? The difference here is intentionality. It's like I'm learning to speak so I can take control of that line of communication, or I'm just at the whim of it. I don't recognize that when I hold my breath, it suggests to my nervous system something stressful is happening. When I'm breathing rapidly, I'm suggesting to my nervous system there is something threatening out there that I need to be ready for, right? That when my breath moves up higher in my chest, it's an indication that perhaps there is something I need to respond to in terms of stress, right? You are communicating whether you know it or not. So the question becomes whether you're willing to learn how to communicate, right? And take control of that and become intentional with it, or you're just going to let that line of communication continue to run. And perhaps you're telling your nervous system that things are really scary, that the world is threatening, that you do need to be in a survival state all of the time. And that is single-handedly going to stop you getting back into a healing state, right? So taking control of this line of communication is really all that breathwork is about. Just a kind of note on breathwork. Some of you may be familiar with that term, and some of you probably think breathwork means, breathing really heavy in a dark room, and some people are crying. Like breathwork's just a big umbrella term. It's just like saying exercise, right? When I say exercise, I could mean running a marathon, I could mean doing yoga, I could mean lifting some weights, right? It is just an umbrella term. So when I say breathwork, I'm really talking about this line of communication. What am I telling my nervous system? Right? And when I learn to do that, I can start to tell my nervous system what it needs to hear so that it can start to change its overriding state. And in doing so, we impact all of these other systems in the body. And so the nervous system, I want you to think about as this kind of core point, and it has all these tendrils that go out, right? My nervous system controls my hormones. It controls my digestion. It controls my energy. It controls my alertness, my focus, my attention, my learning, right? The nervous system is this operating system. And so we're not going to sit here and talk necessarily about, well, how does breathwork impact digestion and how does breathwork impact energy? And because that's all coming back to how does breathwork impact the nervous system and how does the nervous system impact all other functions and processes in the body. This is why breathwork is so powerful. It is not a tool, right, of managing specific symptoms. It is really a general tool, right, that supports the underlying system. And this is a very different model to most of us that have gone through any form of the traditional Western medical system, right, which is specialization at its at its core, right? I go to the kidney specialist who's not talking to the lung specialist, who's not talking to the brain specialist, and they're looking through their own lens, right? They're not really seeing the forest from the trees. Breathwork is really this tool of generality, right? It really is not tied to a specific set of symptoms, a specific outcome that we're looking for in the body. It is supporting the system, right? When we support the system and we start to kind of enhance this self-healing mechanism that we all have, that's where the magic starts to happen. So your breath is like a language. And today we're going to start to teach you how to speak that language. So where we're going to start. Well, we've kind of already started, but I want everyone just to do a really simple, informal self-assessment. Because one of the biggest drivers of breathing, right, is the pattern of our breath. It's how we breathe. So I want everyone to kind of just sit back in their chair for a moment, place one hand on their chest, place one hand on their belly, and just breathe normally. Don't change anything. Just breathe for a few moments. You can close your eyes if you become a little bit more attentive with your eyes closed, and you can just listen to my voice. And you're just really feeling what's moving. Now, the part of your body that's moving is based on the muscles that you're using. Right? Some of you might notice there's some movement in your belly. Others might notice there's more movement in your chest. Now take a big breath and kind of notice what happened. Now you can throw in the chat if you're ready to say, well, it was chest or belly, right? A lot of you will have noticed some movement up here under the sternum or the breastbone, okay? Now, the diaphragm, if I show you, is kind of positioned all the way down here. Now, a muscle that's positioned in this part of my body cannot move this part of my body, right? It's just not a function of that muscle. So if you're feeling the chest kind of rise or expand, some of you might have even noticed your shoulders came up towards your ears. That's an indication that perhaps we're not using our primary breathing muscle, the diaphragm, to the fullest of its capacity. Right? Now, everyone's diaphragm is working. Right? None of you have paralysis of the diaphragm. It's just that how well is it working is a different question. And if you're getting a lot of this movement up here, right, that suggests to us that you're moving using a set of muscles, right, in the neck particularly, that kind of lift up the rib cage. Now, why is that important? Well, this pattern of breath that I just call vertical breathing is very sympathetic nervous system in nature, right? When I lift the rib cage up, it stimulates that branch of the nervous system that suggests something's happening, right? Maybe I'm running away. We see this, ask someone to run up a hill and see how they breathe, right? We see this up and down because I'm trying to just get the air in and out of the top of my lungs. But that is a sympathetic state or situation, right? I've sprinted up a hill. That's when the sympathetic nervous system comes online. But we're all just sitting in a chair right now. No one sprinted up a hill in the last 10 minutes. And so here is the first indication of, is my breathing suggesting to my nervous system that things are safe or that things are scary, right? Now, the next little experiment I want you to do is I want you just to keep your mouth open and take a big breath. And notice what part of your body moved. Right? Again, a lot of you will feel like, yeah, it's up in my chest, maybe in my shoulders. Now, close the mouth and do the same thing. And it may not be dramatic or hugely obvious, but a fair amount of you, most of you will have noticed that felt a little bit different. A different part of my body seemed to move when I closed my mouth and breathed through my nose, right? The big difference again here. So like when I breathe up into my chest, sympathetic nervous system. When I breathe with my mouth, sympathetic nervous system. When I breathe low in my body, right, this kind of expansion of the rib cage, parasympathetic nervous system. When I breathe with my nose, parasympathetic nervous system. Right? Now, that might seem like, oh, well, it doesn't seem like that big of a difference. Times that by 25,000 every single day for decades for some of you, right? And we start to see the problem, right? None of the issues that any of you are facing started yesterday, right? You know that, I know that. And so This is why we start to kind of pay a bit more attention to breathing. And just to give you an example, right? 25,000 times a day, we're looking at 150,000 times a week. We're looking at 600,000 times a month. If you hurt your back 5 years ago and that changed your breath a little bit, you've taken 5 million breaths since then. And if 5 million breaths that were suggesting to your nervous system, things are a bit stressful, right? Impact does that have on the nervous system? Like we can't really comprehend that amount, right, of input, that amount of repetitions, 5 million breaths. So that's 5 years. What if you hurt your back 25 years ago? What if you moved into a really stressful environment and you developed these different breathing patterns 35, 40 years ago? It's like now we start to comprehend why my breathing can be, as Kate said, if not the cause, 100% a contributing factor to what I'm going through right now, right? Because just the sheer amount of breaths that we take on a daily basis, expanded over a period of time, yeah, it's really going to impact the way that I breathe. So we've just kind of done a very simple little self-assessment. Where am I breathing? Now, we are at rest, we're calm. That's going to change if you're a little bit stressed. That's going to change if you change your position, right? Stand up, it's going to be different. Lay down, it's going to be different, right? And so everything I say today, if we're doing and testing this just in a sitting position, that's relevant for a sitting position, right? And so as we get into this kind of drivers of dysfunctional breathing, I want you to consider what goes on in your life, right? How do I spend most of my time? How do I position my body, right? Am I a massage therapist that leans over someone's body? Am I a desk worker, right? Do I talk all day? I'm a teacher. All of these things are going to impact your breathing in a very subtle way. And my goal today is for you to take away the unique information that's relevant to you, right? I have to apply this in a somewhat broad context. We've got a bunch of people on this call that are all a little bit different. And so I want you to kind of think, okay, I talk all day, or I sit at a desk all day, or I hurt my back a couple of years ago, or I've had 4 children in the last 10 years, right? These things are going to impact your breathing in a very unique way. And what I want is for you to take away the information that's relevant so that you know what to do for you rather than a one size fits all approach.